Scheißkopf. Fair enough. This is going to be a... this is best part about the week for me. Starting on every Monday after I have poor sleep by diving directly into stuff that is far outside of my skill or comfort range. It's if you ever wondered if you really need coffee, a thing to do instead of that would be reading Logic of Sense with strangers. It helps. But I think we got a couple people in here, and I want to make sure we get through a lot of this. I'm going to have a lot more questions than usual. Usually I have a bit of a grasp. I did my reading last night, and I'll tell you, I had a lot of questions at the end of that, and I'm going to have questions throughout this. This is feels like, to me, a lot of this was more difficult for me to understand, to be frank, than a lot of the stuff that had come before, which I'm still trying to grasp even why that is the case, but we'll figure it out. So I'll go ahead and kick us off. Thank all of you for joining us on this lovely Monday morning for the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we're going to be diving into the 20th series on the moral problem in Stoic philosophy. Don't have a ton of actual announcements or anything super exciting to dive into, so I kind of just want to get to the cut of this. Where do we even start? Up to this point in Logic of Sense, a lot of the elements have been sort of talking about how signification and meaning is generated. We haven't gotten into the is or oughts or the moral demands or the ethics of a lot of what Deleuze has talked through. Parts of it have, I think, pointed at it, and I think we've made commentary towards that. But here we start actually talking about the moral problem of Stoic philosophy, about the actual ethical ambiguities, the ethics of the system that we're talking about. And again, I'll be frank, this was tough. So, unless does anyone else have any other way to start this off other than diving into what I think is the good opening that, again, I don't necessarily understand, but I'd love to try, is the story of Diogenes with, as with everything Deleuze, it comes back to the egg. So here we'll jump back to the egg, unless anyone else has another comment on this series that might kick it off better than I did.
Yeah, I think it's worth going through this with some care, because it is, like you say, it's quite complex. So I think, yeah, if we just go through it steadily, I think we should hopefully make sense of it.
That is how it feels to me too. And yeah, I don't think, like, very often we'll jump around or I'll skip a paragraph here or there. We can't. Like, this one is this is a lot. So let's open up. I'll read the beginning, and I think it's important to do so. We'll read the little bit of the egg story here. Really, it's the first paragraph. Diogenes Laertius relates that the Stoics compared philosophy to an egg. Quote, "The shell is logic. Next comes the white, ethics, and the yolk. In the center is physics. We sense that Diogenes rationalizes." And I'm going to stop there. What does that sentence mean? Genuinely asking that, not in a rhetorical sense. We sense that Diogenes rationalizes is impenetrable to me.
Well, I think it means he's making a statement based on reason, so rational reason. So he says the shell is logic. So it's has a kind of logic, interior logic to that sentence. So the first is logic, then the white is ethics, and then the yolk is physics. So it's a statement, but it's a rational statement. It seems to make sense. But he says what we need to do. But we can go on to the next bit. If you,
please.
he says it's not if Diogenes, I don't quite know who Diogenes is Diogenes that kind of one we was talking about previously, but if he's a Stoic, he won't say in this way. And he says what Deleuze says, we must recover the Aphorism Anecdote, that is a koan. So how this would be said in a Stoic form? It would be said in terms of an aphorism or an anecdote or the koan, as things we had last week. So Deleuze takes upon himself to actually give this definition, shall we say, of philosophy in a kind of Stoic way. And so he says, we must imagine a situation in which a disciple is raising a question of signification. So to raise a question of signification is to raise a question of the concept. And the following little bit at the end is that it says, what is ethics? So this is a question that is similar to the Platonic, as Socratic question, what is something? So it's asking about the essence of something. So this is essentially the wrong way. The answer to the question posed by the disciple, the disciple's question is, what is ethics? The answer could be contained within that example of the egg. So it's like the white of the egg. But the Stoic answer to that, he takes from a hard-boiled egg from his reversible cloak and designates the egg with his staff. So what Deleuze is doing, he's taking the rational statement that Diogenes is making about philosophy. He's now converting it into a way in which a Stoic would engage with this question of what is ethics. So they take an egg. So the egg is, he said at the beginning, so the egg is philosophy, the shell is logic, the white is ethics, and the yolk is physics. But he said, no, you need to, that's a rational reason, almost Platonic response to the question of what is philosophy, or comparing philosophy to an egg. So he kind of then put it into this form of the Stoic, how a Stoic would deal with this. So he says a Stoic takes a hard-boiled egg and designates the egg with his staff, and then in brackets, or having taken out the egg, he strikes the disciple with his staff, giving him to understand that he himself must provide the answer. And then the disciple in turn takes the staff and breaks the egg in such a manner that a little of the white remains attached to the yolk and a little of the shell. So it's a kind of approaching this idea through the egg, but in a much more kind of Stoic manner, I would say, in that the egg is broken but the things are attached to each other in this way.
So we have on the one side, then we have logic, which is the shell, and then you have this sort of deep yolk, the physics of things, the bodies of things, I guess, and ethics is the thing that ties them together, is the element between them.
Yeah, so he says, so, and because by doing this, the place of ethics is clearly displayed. So by breaking it open and displaying this piece of the egg in which the shell is attached to the white, which is attached to the yolk, he says that otherwise, if it's an egg, it's contained. So in a sense, you can't see it. You just make a kind of, it's an image in your head, so to speak. But here it's actually on display. It's displayed by the action of breaking it with the staff. So it's displayed between the two poles, and these two poles, the two opposite ends, are the pole of the logical shell. So the surface is to do with logic, and the deep physical yolk. So the yolk is to do with physics, and which is to do with nature, to do with things and bodies. I think essentially to do with bodies, I would say. So we've got that same dichotomy we've had previously of the surface, the things at the surface and the things in bodies, the logic at the surface, and here the bodies underneath in the egg itself. But in between them now we have ethics.
So the yolk and the ethics and the logic at the surface. Okay, so the line here toward the end where he says, we have the ethics of bodies, or the morality of words, the moral of what is said, an ethics of foodstuff, or an ethics of language, of eating, of speaking, of the yolk, or of the shell. of states of affairs or of sense, the yoke being the disparate bodies, and the states of affairs or of sense at the surface of the shell, and the in between that the albumin, the white stuff, is the ethics of those things. Yeah, it's rather impenetrable opening to me. I mean, I still I understand what you're saying, and I think I've got a little bit of a better grasp, but it's still difficult.
And I don't think the answer is given in this paragraph, though. I think he's kind of setting things up. So, so he's saying in this way there is this relationship displayed, but he goes on to talk about obviously Humpty Dumpty and Alice. So in this example, Humpty Dumpty, who we've had before, is the Stoic master, and then the disciple's adventure is Alice's adventure. So her adventure consists of climbing back from the depth of the body to the surface of words, and that is the egg, in a sense, the yolk and its relationship to the shell, and of having trouble experience of ethical ambiguity, the ethics of bodies or morality of words. And what that is a reference, we had that previously, didn't we, when I think it was the Queen of Hearts, I think he was talking about the moral of things, the moral of that.
Yes,
so she would say
correct.
something, and then she would say, the Queen would say, and the moral of that is. So this is when the kind of idea of morality, ethics, kind of makes an appearance earlier on. I think here it's beginning to draw out the kind of the relationship.
All right. Well, let's, as you said, we should probably just keep moving, because I'll agree that it's, I mean, definitely the answer is not going to be found inside of that fucking paragraph. So forward we go. He then moves directly into the depths, the line here. The Stoic system contains an entire physics, along with an ethics of this physics. If it is true that passions and evil intentions are bodies, it is true that goodwill, various actions, true representations, and just consents are also bodies. If it is true that certain bodies form abominable, cannibalistic, and incestuous mixtures, the aggregate of bodies taken as a whole necessarily forms a perfect mixture, which is nothing other than the unity of causes among themselves in the cosmic presence, in relation to which evil itself can only be an evil of consequence. This feels like an extraordinary statement. My interpretation of it, and as he kind of moves on, is that he's God, this one was difficult. The idea here is that there is almost a willing of the evil to come about, the evil of consequence, that the bodies as a whole is necessarily sort of just bodies, this perfect mixture, as he says. And for him and the Stoics, the way he's talking about it is it's a movement from not necessarily the bodies having any ethical framework, but instead the thrust of the body's actions, as he goes on to say. Again, pushing back towards event, Stoic ethics being concerned with this event, not necessarily the bodies. The bodies just are what they are. That sort of feels like the setup he's taking here. Am I far off?
Yeah, I think it's worth going back to the beginning, right at the beginning of that paragraph, because he said that we moved too quickly previously. So he is talking about bodies, as you say, but previously, what was discovered in the depth, and it was this what he calls infernal mixtures, corresponding to passion bodies for evil intentions. So the depth, there was this idea of the evil and all these different other things going on. But he says, but the Stoic system contains an entire physics along with an ethics of this physics. So he said we moved too quickly, because what he didn't bring into was the ethics associated with this depth. But previously, it was just bringing out the object. I'm trying to think of a better word for it. The objectionable side of the bodies. But he's saying that what he didn't do was bring out the So the physics is to do with the depth, it's to do with nature. So along with he said the Stoic system contains an entire physics along with an ethics of this physics. So the two things are there together. As previously, it wasn't really, they weren't brought out, that the ethical side wasn't really brought out. He says, then he goes on to say, if it is true that passions and evil intentions are bodies, which is the kind of Stoic belief that things like passions and evil intentions are bodies. This is one of their kind of basic beliefs. This kind of the idea that bodies apply to a very large degree of things. He said it's true that goodwill, virtuous actions, true representation, and just consents are also bodies. So the bodies are not only the evil intentions, etc., and the passions, but it's also the goodwill, the good thing, the virtuous actions are also bodies, which implies there can be a mixture of those. These things can combine in some way. So he goes on to say, if it's true that certain bodies form abominable, cannibalistic, incestuous mixtures.
Okay, wait. I want to pull back just because, before you move on, because that feels like itself an important point that is going to be visited again here very shortly. But the idea basically that, I don't know how else to phrase this. This may sound stupid. We have bodies, and we have bodies that are decidedly, we'll say, evil or bad or negative, but also the positive. All of those elements are body, all sort of ethical things. The elements themselves are bodies. Passions, evil intentions, those are ethical things. Those are, the murder is an ethical thing. So is hugging, I guess, would be like a sort of like, is that what is that?
No, I don't think so. I don't, perhaps he is, but I mean, the way I read it was that, see, previously he was talking about things of the depth, kind of have this notion of evil, the cannibalism, etc., etc. But he's saying that alongside that, there's an ethics of this physics. I think, for me, I don't know, perhaps you could be right there, but I would say that goodwill, virtuous actions, true representation, just consents are the kind of are the ethical bodies rather than the evil bodies. But if ethics implies the opposite of the ethical, I don't know if it does, but if it does, then that might be correct. I mean, I'm just seeing them as two separate things, because he's already brought out these notions of evil intentions in terms of bodies.
I'm probably misusing ethical there. To be more specific, the sort of the ethical judgment upon actions, because he phrases it here as evil intentions. That's like an ethical judgment. Passions, evil passions, goodwill, virtuous actions, true representations, just consents. Like basically saying that all of these elements that are part of what I, Brooks, feel as the sort of causes of like good or bad, maybe in the more traditional Platonic sense, like, oh, if someone has negative will or wants to do harm or desire or whatever, those are things of the depth. He's also saying, no, it's also it's also the other side, that these just actions, virtuous actions, good things, those are also bodies. And that altogether there's like this ridiculously perfect mixture, in relation to which evil itself can only be an evil of consequence. That the action, the phrasing of that as I read it, because we're going to be getting into the quasi-cause shit again, because that's always fun. But it's this idea that it's not so much that the thing itself is evil, it's evil of consequence. It comes after the fact, even though we assign it to the sort of cause element. But it's not the case that these bodies passions, there are also bodies actions, unified bodies of the cosmos. Stoic ethics is concerned with the event, consists of willing the event as such, that is, of willing that which occurs insofar as it does occur. That's these terribly written sentences. I don't understand what that one means, but now I'm confused myself. I hurt myself in the confusion. That sucks. God damn it.
Yeah, I think they. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I think there's. So I think the idea of willing is kind of obviously central to ethics, I would say. But I think that kind of emerges towards the end of this series. The kind of placing this notion of willing within the system, I think, comes later, I would say. I mean, I think let's just go back. I mean, I think, sorry.
They asked the question going back to the basic idea of the egg, the three parts of the egg. Does that represent the kind of, in rational terms, the entire notion of the virtual, the actual, and then the actual causing the event, so you're back to the virtual. So are those the three parts? The egg represents the three parts of, this idea of virtual actualization and the event.
I so
Right.
I'm not
So
going to say I have an answer, but I went the same place you did, because I wonder, are we mixing eggs? I guess would be my question, because later on in Deleuze and Guattari and Deleuze's writing, the egg obviously shows up, I think, in the way you're talking about, JK. We've even had it in our readings for AO, the discussion about the egg and it being this sort of, essentially a body without organs of sorts and a plane of virtual blah, blah, blah. And we're kind of hitting that. Is this a different
right,
egg, or is this playing towards that as well, is a great question.
right. So the as opposed to Diogenes, the rationalization of the egg into three parts, the koan is a process of the method of getting there to that understanding of these three parts, without that kind of rationalization. Breaking the egg and being able to understand ourselves in terms of these three parts of ourselves as actualization, virtual actualization, and the event, virtual. So the shell is a surface where we, arrive at the, quasi cause or whatever, the potential for the event, the sense, right? And so the ethics of Stoic ethics is concerned with the event, not just with, the ethics is the white part of the egg, language and all that stuff that incorporates the ideas, the representations of the physics of the state of affairs. But the main concern is with Stoic ethics is this kind of the realization of the event, of being on that surface where, yeah. So yeah, it's a.
Well, I think it's quite clear what's said at the beginning, that Diogenes compares philosophy to an egg. So he says philosophy is and the shell is logic, the white is ethics, and the yolk is physics. So he's kind of he's comparing philosophy as a whole to an egg. But
Right,
what Deleuze wants to do is break it up. He wants to subject it to a kind of stoic kind of analysis, which involves striking, breaking it open, and displaying the center, and displaying how the yolk is attached to the white, which is attached to the shell, and that kind of, and it's made visible, it's made clear. The Diogenes image is as Deleuze says, it's a kind of, it's rational. It has a notion of kind of rational logic behind it. It kind of makes in our heads it makes sense. It makes sense in our heads, whereas what the approach is to make it clear through a physical action of breaking it.
Right. So philosophy is concerned with the static genesis, the dynamic genesis, and then ultimately the event at the surface, the sense. But
I don't think he says that. I just think he's making I think it's overcomplicating it. I think he's just saying, if you, it says Diogenes says that compares philosophy to an egg, and he just says shell is. So these are three elements, and there are three elements according to this in this definition contained within this image. Let's not call it definition.
right,
One is logic, one is ethics, one is physics,
right. So,
and I think that's all that's being said. I think, but then what the Deleuze wants to do is to kind of subject it to this aphorism, is convert that into a kind of what he calls the Aphorism Anecdote, which is a koan, which is that kind of statement in which a kind of paradoxical statement that the Stoics engage in.
right, right. So if the egg represents a philosophy, right, and a kind of like understanding, a true understanding, but he's saying that the shell represents the surface, right? But the surface has to be broken in order to get to this event.
No,
Realize the event. No.
no. I think you're making too much of it. Basically, it's just breaking the egg to display the relationship between the yolk, the white, and the shell.
So that's the event. Yeah.
That's all he's doing.
Exactly. Right. So that's the event.
I don't know.
Yeah. Whereas the whole egg, that he's described, Diogenes describes in these, the egg is consisting of three parts, is a kind of a rationalization. But it's not enough.
Yeah,
That kind of rationalization is not enough.
No, not within the orbit of kind of Stoic philosophy.
Right, exactly.
But I think the so we have that at the first paragraph, the structure of this series. So the first paragraph have this image of the egg, and then it's subjected to a kind of Stoic kind of analysis, in inverted commas, which is basically being struck with a staff and being broken. And the three elements of philosophy that are set out by Diogenes are then made visible, they're laid out. So the yolk is attached to the white, which is then attached to the shell. So the three are kind of intrinsically linked to each other. And then the next paragraph, it then looks more or less at the yolk. It's looking at the bodies. So how is ethics attached to the bodies? This is, I think, the question that's being asked in the next section. Because he said, we moved too quickly. Previously, we just said, in the depth, which is nature or the yolk.
Right.
It
So
was passion bodies, even intentions.
Right. So the ethics it has to do with the language and representation, and what should it represent in order to, achieve this kind of event. Right? In order to achieve that event, you have to use language as representation, and as also as two parts. He says representation and expression.
Yeah, I think it's worth going through the whole paragraph there just to see how the bodies are dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there is this idea of representation, but it's a kind of different idea of representation. Depends obviously what you mean by representation.
Right. He says that there's a true representation. Yeah, true representation and just consent are also bodies and consent something.
But I think what we need to do, I mean, like I said, I think we need to go through this in order. So rather than jumping about, I think it's better if we kind of just go through it to try and get our heads around it, because it is very complex, this one.
Right.
Because I think it's dealing here with ethics and its relationship to bodies, which is the white of the egg in relation to the yolk. And because it comes on to divination, so that the end of this paragraph, so half of the paragraph of this second paragraph is concerned with divination. And he says divination grounds ethics. So it'd be interesting to know why he says this.
Well, which one do we start with then? Because I think that you're right, going in order is going to be necessary. So do we start with straight the idea of willing the event, or do we move straight to the sort of second half of this paragraph and dive right into the idea of divination that grounds ethics? Because how could event be grasped and willed without it being referred to the corporeal cause from which it results, and through this cause to the unity of causes as physics? Again, pushing back towards the yoke of things. The idea that divination grounds ethics. Would that be the place to start?
Yeah, I mean, well, if we, right. So you said, just to recap a little bit. So it's, as you said, Brooks, earlier, Stoic ethics are concerned with the event, consists of willing the event such as it is, or willing that which incurs insofar as it does occur. So he's making statements, a series of statements about Stoic ethics and what it's concerned with. He said, but we cannot yet evaluate the import of these formulations. So we can't actually make a judgment on these formulations. They are formulations, but we can't actually say a lot about them. So that's the first thing he says. But in any case, how could the event be grasped and willed without it being referred to the corporal cause from which it results? And through this cause, the unity of causes physics. So he's talking about the event is referred to the corporeal cause. So the events come out of the action of bodies, and bodies working together. So, and then he goes into divination. So here divination grounds ethics. So it's through divination that ethics is grounded. And it's divination, so it's divination that allows the relationship between ethics and the physics to take place, I would say. So then I would say we need to kind of try and understand what this it seems to us, I don't know about you guys, but it seems very, when I first read it, I was kind of surprised by this notion of divination suddenly appears,
like magic.
Yeah, well, it's like foretelling something through looking in, and it gives you examples of divination in this, the rest of this paragraph. So it's divining something, foreseeing something, looking into something. So allowing, and if basically what it's being looked at is nature, is the physics, the things, the bodies themselves are allowing you to see something, to understand something. So he's saying here, divination grounds ethics. So in this paragraph, it's talking about the relation between the yolk and the white, between physics and ethics.
Is it kind of a
so?
It's kind of a representation. What he means by true representation?
I don't think so. But we don't know. It might be. I don't know. I mean, I think it's useful to kind of try and just work our way through it, so that we can understand what's actually being said.
Is that part of the process of willing the event that is, which occurs insofar as it does occur? It's sort of like the amor fati, that you will which you're destined,
So he says the divination grounds ethics. So the divinatory interpretation consists of the relation between the pure event, not yet actualized. So it's an event that is not made real or actual.
The resultant,
the depth of bodies, the corporeal.
The resultant event, the result event, because it is the timing of this, the place and time is incredibly important. I just want to reiterate, super important. Sorry, go ahead, Derek. I didn't mean to interrupt. It was just a piece.
No, it's like, I think we're all trying to make sense of this together, so it's good, So, right, then he says we can state how this interpretation proceeds. So this divination, I would say, right, and he then lays it out how this process of divination is a question of cutting into the thickness, of carving out surfaces oriented in them, of increasing and multiplying in order to follow out trace of lines, incisions inscribed on them. So that's a kind of, let's call it a theoretical process. But then he gives actual processes, so actual examples of this process of cutting into bodies and into the physics. That's the general term for things, around us, nature. So the sky, so he gives the first example: the sky is divided into sections, and a bird's line of flight is distributed according to them. So that's a divination according to the flight of a bird in the sky, which we've segmented off. So if it goes along that line, it means this will happen. If it goes along that line, that will happen. And then there's also this notion of a pig on the ground. So they have the sky. Now we have the ground. On the ground, the letter traced by the pig's snout. And then the liver from inside the body is drawn up to the surface where it lines as fissures are observed. So that was another process of divination when you looked at the liver of an animal and he said, oh yeah, this is going to happen tomorrow, you know, this kind of thing. And so he says from that, divination is, in the most general sense, the art of surfaces, lines, and singular points appearing on the surface. So this is all this talk about the relation between ethics and physics. He says this is why two fortune tellers cannot regard one another without laughing, a laughter which is humorous. Now, that I was slightly puzzled by, but well, still I think I am a bit puzzled by. But things at the surface, I was just rereading last week's, I think, to try and understand this bit. But humor is the kind of when sense and nonsense appear at the surface. So I would say that is a kind of, and that's because last week we talked about humor. So it's a laughter which is humorous. So I think in this paragraph, he's laying out this kind of the relation between ethics and physics, and it's kind of driven through this divination. It's bringing things to the surface. So the liver is drawn to the surface. So it said divination in the most general sense, the art of surfaces, lines, and singular points appearing on the surface. So things that are there at the surface. But in the next paragraph.
Okay, just real quick, because I think divination is probably where I keep getting fucked up on this, to be perfectly frank, because it's throughout the rest of this. But it's this idea, to say another way, we have the everyday lived experience of everyone. There are things, and there are good things, bad things, all kinds of different stuff, cannibalistic passions, whatever it is, all that stuff. And then in time, those things interact, and then event happens. An event has the willing of the event happens sort of after said act. In between that, I, the subject, or however we want to phrase it, divines this interpretation of a relation between these corporeal actions, the stuff as it's moving, and the resultant event. This divination is the carving out, the increasing and the multiplying of surfaces. It's an exceptionally large amount of possibility space, it feels like, that divination is able to play in, but it is a little bit like making shit up. I make shit up. I say, here is, these things went together. Oh, here's what happened. I good or bad or whatever it is, I say my shit. I divine this interpretation of the relation between the corporeal actions and the resultant event. And this carves out elements that ultimately become that, and he's going to start talking about that quasi-cause afterwards, but this seems to be the three steps. Like, divination is the way that we, utilize pattern recognition and the sense generation mechanics we've learned so far in order to ground things within ethics.
Yeah, I think he might be saying that instead of the, dealing with this in terms of a cause and effect, scientific cause and effect pattern, he's talking about another kind of pattern, which is maybe related to synchronicity, where the fortune tellers, and if you use the other, astrology or the I Ching, you incorporate this kind of synchronicity. Where it's not just a straight cause effect pattern, a linear cause and effect pattern, but it takes into account all these other events that occur by chance or by synchronicity.
Yeah, well, and so if we want to go through his three examples, two of them make no sense to me, and I don't even understand the liver one and the sky being divided into sections. I can't figure those out. But the pig one hits me in the sense that if you haven't spent a lot of time around pigs, that's kind of what their noses do, is they drag around, and it's completely a thing that happens where once in a while you wonder if a pig intended to draw a thing, like say a letter, and it's obviously not, but the way that your brain absolutely recognizes such action, it happens. And so this idea that you follow on the ground the letter traced by a pig's snout, like the pig's snout is not tracing a letter. Like it's happening that way. Sure, there is a semblance of a letter that you're able to recognize that is being traced in the ground by a pig who has no idea what the fuck. It could just be, it's totally random. But that act in and of itself is that divinatory interpretation, which is the relations between the pure event, which is not yet actualized, and the way that bodies are sort of how they're existing. And we divine out the letter traced by the pig's snout. That's the closest I come to something that is like semi-coherent to me.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think that we are kind of missing, I suspect, in this is this concept of the cosmos, because earlier on, prior to this discussion of divination, he talks about, so he says, if there are bodies, passions, there are also bodies, actions, unified bodies of the great cosmos. And it's a kind of idea which I find difficult to get my head around, but I think there's an idea that there's a kind of unified, things are kind of unified in this notion of the cosmos. And so in that way, the things of the earth, the physics, can be used in a certain way. So they like the sky, the bird in the sky, will enable us to interpret, to kind of look into the future or whatever. The pig drawing the line with its nose, and the liver being looking at the fissures in the pig.
Also,
And I think there is a relationship to the cosmos, this cosmic relationship between things to do with physics, to do with the bodies, and the bodies of ethics, the way the bodies of the passion, what he calls the passion bodies, and the bodies actions, the ethics and the physics kind of go together. I suspect within this cosmic relationship, which is one that is still not clear, personally speaking.
well, at the end of Difference in Repetition, Deleuze makes clear that his notion, his idea of the virtual aeon is not a cosmos. He calls it a chaosmos. So he takes into account the importance of chance, in this notion of the cosmos. So chance plays a very important role in his metaphysics, right? And
Yeah, but I think he's talked about Stoics, isn't he? He's talked about Stoic philosophy,
right.
and I think and I think you're right. I think chance does play a part, a big part in this whole notion of this kind of structure that we've already come across. So in terms of sense and the heterogeneous series and the kind of relationship between the two, and the quasi cause, and the role of chance is central to that, I would say.
Right. So if his ethics is to as the Stoics say, to will something that is that which occurs insofar as that it does occur, how do you will that unless how do you will that which you wouldn't know unless you take into account the element of chance and or synchronicity, which is the coincidence of events based on not a particular rational cause, but on these other random elements, random events like the pig snout, and so forth, the liver, and tea leaves, reading tea leaves, and so forth. So there's an element of chance there that has to be incorporated, and this is, I think, what he means by divination.
I
I
think
don't
that
think.
in Eastern that in Eastern, that particularly in Taoism, there's a lot of that, which I think someone already spoke to the I Ching, that there's a lot of people that try to make it into divination, reading tea leaves and such, and that's a real shame, I think. And I think that any self-professed Taoist would say that that's a bastardization of what is kind of a a personal endeavor to try to lie to another person. I think that the culmination of it would be to know when to I think that that's kind of the effort to divine something, quote unquote, is an effort to kind of pull one over on someone else.
Right.
A lot of the time, like, if you're a palm reader or something like that.
Right. Yeah, there's the I Ching, like for instance, has been say bastardized into these fortune tellers and become a kind of divination of the worst kind. But as Carl Jung, in his foreword to the I Ching, by Wilhelm, um, calls it synchronicity instead of divination. You know? So it's a psychological. It brings in the psychological and maybe the scientific, into it. So there's that operating there. So, Deleuze, calls it divination. I think maybe that's what he's referring to.
No, I think the Stoics call it divination. I think it is divination. That is definitely part of the Stoic philosophy.
Exactly.
So I don't think he's kind of saying this word. The Stoic philosophy was a part of Stoic philosophy was concerned with divination. But what he's saying here, so if you look at the next paragraph, he says, it's not accidental that Stoic ethics were unable and had no desire to trust in physical methods of divination. So it didn't trust in these physical methods of divination. And it oriented itself towards an entirely different pole. So if you remember, the two poles are the shell of logic and the yoke of physics. So it oriented itself towards an entirely different pole. That it developed in accordance with an entirely different method, namely logic. So now we're now moving towards the kind of relation between ethics and logic, I would say.
I think divination could be like drawing correlation. It's like that, the mental effort of drawing correlation between two things, I think, is about as far as it goes for me, anyways.
Looking at the Stoics, divination is the interplay between the logos, which would be the logic, and the physics. And it's through the ethics that comes to play, right? So in order to avoid a fatalism of just cause and effect, everything being determined, that's why we can will the event, which the event is also the sense, so the logical. And it's a compatibilist view where it's not all predetermined, that it is open to kind of a flux by our will.
Well, and I think that's actually that's actually a good point for us to move to the next paragraph, because I think as we talk about the flux between the two sides, I'll just read part of this. It is not accidental that Stoic ethics was unable and had no desire to trust in physical methods of divination, that it oriented itself towards an entirely different pole. Ollie, mute yourself. Victor Goldschmidt has clearly shown these two poles between the Stoic ethics oscillates. On one hand, it would be a question of participating to the greatest possible extent in a divine vision which gathers in depth all the physical causes in the unity of a cosmic present, in order to elicit the divination of events which ensue. This, I feel like, this is kind of what Nemo, was it Nemo who was just said, like, where, I think it was. And then on the other hand, however, it is a question of willing the event, whatever it may be, without any interpretation, thanks to an urge of representations which accompanies the event ever since its first actualization, assigning it the most limited present possible. Oh my.
Is it usage, Brooks? I've got usage of representation.
Usage of representation. I'm sorry if I missaid that. Thanks to a usage of representations, which accompanies the event. Apologies if I missaid that.
Question? Can
Of
I
course.
make a, regarding divination, like, what I am asking is like, if it is related to a method of cracking of an egg. If we go back to the first part, I think an egg is quite interesting metaphor, if I say, because like in an egg that is like layers, like as it is described, like the shell, and then the next part, next layer, and the next layer. At the end of the day, like representation can vary according to how it goes into from shell to the yolk. So actually, divination is like how to make a crack on the shell, and then it could change of the representation for actualization. So it's the matter of like corporeality and corporeality of an event. So some events maybe like think about the yolk. Some yolk already like goes further like to the maturity. So it is ready to be a chicken or something like that. But some yolk is immature, so something like that. So you don't know exactly from the shell what kind of yolk it's inside of an egg. So what according to an event, sometimes it can be described as a not to come. Sometimes like it can say like actualization of an event or something like that, according to how much it can be incorporated by the singularity of each egg. So the point here, what I'm thinking, or what I want to ask is that divinity making some kind of crack in each egg, and then that can be really singular. It can be all different, and then it can make a different actualization, different corporality of an event.
I thank you for that. I really like that. So, okay, to say another way, because I hope I'm understanding you. When we go back and we have the hard-boiled egg, and we have the student and the master, and the student dashes or cracks the egg, we get some of the yolk, some of the white, and some of the shell all connected. And the whites is essentially the ethics that grabs some part of the bodies, the yolk, the molecules that are the yolk, but also is holding on to some pieces of the logic at the surface. And every time we do that, it's a slightly different shape of the white or whatever it may be. And it's about sort of this version of actualizing all of this sort of as a connection, and that in the ethical sort of event, in the event as it happens, we're basically collecting the different shapes of white that attaches yolk to event as we go.
Yeah, that's kind of like yeah, I'm thinking that way too. So here, like an expression like a cosmic present, is that good? That's a good words, but I just lost the part. But the point is that there is a word cosmic present things out there, right? So I am wondering like if that is about like how to be mingled, like all kind of a shell, and then white part, and then yolk. How can it be mixed? That can be like a singular according to an each egg, because like I don't know, every egg is different, right? And then the way of, I mean, mixture, I mean, would be all different inside that. I mean, the portion of logic, the portion of ethics, the portion of physicality, all would be different, and then the way of a mixture would be different too.
Well, I think that follows the lines that follow the part I just read. In one case, we link the event to its corporal causes, physical unity. The other, we link it to incorporeal quasi-cause, the kind of causality which it gathers and makes resonate. The two sides that you're talking about, this seems to fit. This is actually interesting. Derek, JC, JK, anyone else have thoughts on that? I'm going to process. It's a lot to process.
I think that's it's like a further embellishment on what he's saying about divination. I think it's a very confusing term, and so we have to like just explicate that, right? Like string it out a little bit, see what it actually means, and because it can be very confusing. I think the important element I was just stating that trying to make it any sort of a causal thing is, I think, a very misled effort. I mean, and I do think that at times it's not without basis. I think that it can be a good thing to try to make it a causal and extrapolate meaning from it, but that's from the act of divination. But other than that, I think that I just think that the chaosmotic of effort of it, I think that I was just trying to state that there's an explication of that should be had in that particularly.
Well, so it's the use of divination here to put a fine point on it. Maybe it's worth maybe having a discussion about literally what that means, because there's a lot of usages of it. Here, very specifically, he's talking about, to me, I believe, which would be Cicero's book of divination. I picked it up last night. The very short version is this: divination is to Cicero this presenting of and knowledge of future things. This, here is what's coming to me, the divination of looking into the future by looking at the things around you immediately, the prediction and presentment of those things which are thought to occur by chance. And this is divination. So there is some level, absolutely, there is the chaos of it, and that's part of the Stoic thing, is this understanding that there is this sort of the chaosmos, as you may say, but the divination to them is kind of what we're doing when we place the knowledge of, here are the bodies, here's the stuff that's going on, here's how they work together, sort of a direct causality that's hyper complex, and we divine a almost line forward where we say, here is how things are going to continue to go, and that's divination, at least as far as I understand it, as Cicero talked about it.
Brooks, page 144, my version, there is part of Cicero, right? And then what I'm asking is I'm wondering, a divination has to do with the direction, the crack comes from the surface to the center, but at the same time, can we imagine that some kind of change can derive from the center to the surface, So it can be related to page 144. I'm afraid that my version is same as yours, but the 144 Cicero part that is talking about Chronos and Ion. So sometimes the logic leads us, but sometimes physically leads us. So I'm trying to ask you if divination could be related to the directions it could not be linear one way. It could be like a really reciprocal or diverse ways, something like that.
I mean, I have no idea. My gut reaction is that he's being very clear here about there's sort of two ways that this happens, and there's one that is on the one hand, question of participating in the greatest possible extent into divine vision, which gathers in depth all the causes, and in order to elicit events which ensue, which is kind of a, let's say, an inside out way to do it, if we're talking about the egg. On the other hand, it's willing the event, whatever it may be, without any interpretation, thanks to the usage of representations which accompanies the event ever since its first actualization, assigning it to the most limited present possible. Feels like more of an outside in. So it does feel like there is some kind of directionality to it. I'm hardly a scholar on this, so it's just a guess.
I think what's being said is that, so we have this idea of divination in which ethics participate. So it says it's a thing in which ethics participates. Ethics participates in divination, and through the divine vision, which it's a quote, which gathers in depth all the physical cause and the unity of a cosmic presence. What I was talking about earlier, the notion of the cosmos. So in this sense, ethics participates in that. But on the other hand, as the quote is, it is a question of willing the event, whatever it may be, without any interpretation. So the divination is the interpretation. So on the other hand, and he says basically in the beginning of this paragraph, he says that the Stoics do not choose the route of divination. They choose the other route, which is the question of willing the event, whatever it may be, without interpretation, thanks to a usage of representations. He puts that in inverted commas, and it's important. It's an important phrase, because I think this is the kind of way in which the kind of ethics and logic are connected through this this so-called usage of representation. And he basically leaves divination behind. I think divination is not that important within this. It's kind of brought out at the beginning because it's part of the egg. It's kind of the way in which ethics and physics kind of join. But he said it's not actually the actual route that the Stoics take. They take a different route, which is relation to the ethics relating to logic, which is clearly what he says at the beginning of this paragraph. And it's done through this thing called the usage of representation. And I think it's useful for us to try and then to think, well, what does this, because this notion of representation has come up a few times. So now it's been broadened out into this phrase usage of representation. So we need to I think, need to understand what that means. And I think the next 2 or 3 paragraphs are devoted to this idea of the usage of representation.
I can agree with that. I think divination is actually fairly important, because I think it's where he's going to be deriving a lot of this, because pieces are slowly coming together. But yeah, no, I think it's time to move on towards representation. I will open up anyone has any thoughts last on this paragraph before we move kind of to the next step of representation, the usage of things and expression, please.
Yeah, I wanted to understand what the Stoics they were oscillating between one pole and another. One pole, I think, maybe the unity of a cosmic present refers to the chronos, right? Like taking into account and that has to do with divination, with the but the other is more towards the logic of the usage of representation that he's going to talk about here, and that is more related to the ion, but the ion is not understood as something that occurs on a straight line, on a linear straight line, but it occurs unpredictably. So I think that's he's going to go into like what answering the question what true representation means. Yeah. That's what I want to say.
No, that's also not
Yeah, I think
please,
Sorry,
Ollie,
Go ahead.
Ollie, go for it. Ollie, please.
No. I just wanted to say I agree with him.
Well, then, awesome. Derek, go for it.
I think what Deleuze at the end of that paragraph, he says why the first pole, i.e., the relationship between physics and ethics, is not suitable. He says the insufficiency of the first pole derives from the fact that events, being corporeal effects, differ in nature from the corporeal causes from which they result. That they have other laws than they do, and determined only by the relations between incorporeal quasi-cause. Now, because the first thing, the first pole relates ethics to its cause. The bodies are the cause. So that's why it's insufficient. So this is why he's now going on the next paragraph. So he said that the relationship is between ethics and the usage of representations. And it begins that next paragraph, says, what is the logical usage of representation? So he's asking this question, which he's then going to spend, I think, at least this paragraph and perhaps others talking about, trying to understand this notion of the usage of representation.
Yeah, and I mean, he opens it up and says very cleanly, the Stoic theory of representation is itself obscure, which is a light way of putting it. I was not able to find very much on it at all, so it's obscure by almost any standard. But
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, let's just go through it a little bit, because it says, what is the logical usage of representation? Namely of this art. So it's an art, it's a kind of, it's a technique, let's call it that. It's another word for art. It's a way of doing things, which reached its peak in the works of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. And as you say, it's the Stoic theory of representation is obscure, as it has been handed down to us. And it says the role and nature of a sense in the sensible corporal representation is something borrowed the manner in. But anyway, sorry, I just wanted to just.
I'm gonna actually continue the rest of, because it's a long sentence that you started. It's so long, I'm just gonna read the end of it, which is like the third semicolon, top of 145. Above all, that which constitutes the character of representation, such that it may or may not be comprehensible. And finally, the scope of the difference between representations, bodies, or imprints, and incorporeal events effects, between representations and expressions. This is it. These last two difficulties concern us here essentially, since sensible representations are denotations and rational representations are significations, while only incorporeal events constitute expressed sense. Oof.
Let's just, I mean, no, go on, what you're going to say.
I fucking don't know what I was going to say. Go for it.
Okay. Sorry, just to get the last two difficulties right. So I'm trying to pick my way back here. So I'll have to read this because I think I need to. The role and nature of sense is a sensible corporeal representation as something borrowed. The manner by which rational representation, but still corporeal, derive from sensible representations. So this notion is, above all, that which constitutes a character such that it may amount to be comprehensible and find the scope of the difference between representative body or incorporeal event. I think we really need to pick this one apart personally in some detail, but perhaps we haven't got enough time to do that. So the difference between representation bodies or imprints and incorporeal event effects. And I think that the main difference is between representations and expressions, he says here. And the thing is, what is an expression? It's the thing that is expressed. It's the kind of sense that's expressed. And it's these last two difficulties that concern us here essentially, since sensible representations, so the representation that we receive as sense, the ideas or the thoughts we receive through our senses are denotations. And if we think back to what a denotation is, then we can see how that kind of does make sense. So a denotation is a state of affairs that's fulfilled in the speaking. So it relates to something that we come across either by seeing it or hearing it or whatever. And then there's a rational representation, so signification. So we have two kinds of representation here. We have sensible, something given to the senses, and rational, given to the mind. And he says that the rational, so the sensible representation are denotations, and rational representation is signification. And signification is a concept. So they're given as concepts. So one is given as denotation. So it's a kind of, the thing that's fulfills what's given to us is a denotation, and signification is a concept of something. It says, while only incorporeal events constitute express sense. So we have this notion between representation and expressions given within that, I would say.
Right. And he goes on to say essentially that representation its adequacy comes from the way it envelops the expression. It can never represent the expression, the event of dying actualized in the state of affairs and expressed in the concept. It can't ever actually deal with the expression itself. It's this sort of thing that it can only ever resemble. It can't actually directly sort of be that thing. It's a problem with it. It's to read off one of the sets of notes I've got. Representation only has truth concretely by means of the event it envelops, giving it an open problematic structure. To go back to the problematic series of where and when, and it remains external or abstract in the concept and its instances. The way that representation plays inside of all of these different events and inside of all of these things ultimately is just resembling it, but not actually dealing with the thing itself. And that's, to go back to what you were just saying, Derek, this idea of it is not that the representation of the thing is the thing, because we have denotations and significations, which are the physical and the physics and the logic. This sort of, if we want to talk about the egg again, we have the yolk and we have the shell, and the representation that sort of utilizes those, the large scale thing, is not actually those elements. It's playing with them, but it's not them. Or did I go in the wrong direction? I'm going to guess I went in the wrong direction.
So is he saying that representations are denotation and rational and
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
are caught in
Sorry, I was
trapped inside the circle of language. So
Yeah.
the idea is to
So
get out
what?
of that circle of language, right, into the expression.
No.
No.
Well, sorry, I was whittering away and I had myself on mute. So I think at the beginning of that paragraph it says by itself. So it says by itself representation is given up to extrinsic relation of resemblance. So this is what representation does. It resembles something, has this notion of resemblance or similitude, but its internal character. So what he's trying to talk about here is the kind of structure of representation. So it's extrinsically has to do with resemblance. So that's what a representation does. It has a resemblance to something. So we have a sensible representation. It's something given as something to our senses. And similarly, a rational representation is something gives itself as a representation to our mind, So he says, so there is this relation of resemblance a representation have. That's on the surface. That's extrinsic relationship, but its internal character, by which it is in. So there's these different degrees of being a representation. It can be a distinct representation, an adequate representation, or a comprehensive representation. Comes to the manner in which it encompasses or envelops an expression. So there is this relationship between the representation and the expression is one that essentially the expression is kind of inside the representation. It's encompassed by the representation.
Is it the shell?
Sorry. Well, logic. The shell. If we're going back to that early image.
Yes.
the shell in that sense is logic. I think the whole thing is relationship between logic and ethics. But I think what he's trying to get at. So he talks about this notion, go back to that earlier thing of there is a usage of representation. And then that's the kind of thing he's trying to kind of grasp, because he said that, as he says at the beginning of this paragraph, it's kind of obscure. We're not kind of clear what it is. And so the theory of representation is kind of obscure. And so he has these two things. We have the expression and we have the representation. So the representation bodies and incorporeal events effects. I would say that that's what they are. And it's about the relationship between the two. And what he's essentially saying here is that the representation kind of encompasses the expression, I would say. And then to understand it further, I think we need to look at this example he gives. So he says the perception of death as a state of affairs and as a quality. So let's kind of try if we can go through this. The example of death as a state of affairs and as a quality, or as a concept moral. So we have two things there. We have death as a state of affairs, which can be denoted. So it's an affair. So death, we see death before, sort of state of affairs, lots of dead things in front of us, or quality, that person is dead. So those are the two things. So this perception of death as a state of affairs as quality, or the concept mortal as a predicate of signification. So that's a concept which we can attach to someone. So we are mortal, therefore we are at some point will be subject to death.
Well, it's the combination though. Like just real quick, because I don't want to leave this example yet. It's the example of you have the states of affairs and those of quality, and then on the other side you have the mortal as the predicate of signification. You have the denotation and signification as those two elements. Representation has to like they both have to come together. One as being actualized, and then the other is being expressed.
Hang on. Look, let's just go through it. So he's just said that this is who we have. He's taking death as an example, and it can be denotated, or signified. So expressed in a denotation or expressed in a concept, as a concept. But he says, but as long as they do not encompass the event of dying as that which is actualized in one, expressed in the other. So he says, for example, the perception of death, state affairs, or the concept mortal predicates remain extrinsic, i.e. deprived of sense, so they have no sense. So we can denote the idea of death, or signify it and conceptualize it, but they're deprived of sense as long as they do not encompass the event of dying. And the event of dying is the expression. So he's giving this example of the way in which the representation encompasses the expression, and the representation is encompassed by in the denotation and signification of death in it as mortal, or as examples of death or being dead. But it's deprived of sense as long as it not encompass the event of dying as that which is actualized in the one, expressed in the other. So death is actualized in one, i.e. the first one, the denotation, and expressed in the other. And it's a bit like that. We had that.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Derek. I tried to tag you, like, I tried to say something, but after you want to finish what you wanted to say?
What? Yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit. So, what if we remember back to the example he gives of this, which is the battle? Remember the battle? Remember that example? I can't remember which series it is, but the soldier who's mortally wounded. Do you remember that? And he says it has this impassibility. It's only reached by being mortally wounded. Sorry. Anyway, sorry. Go on.
Taking to you, like, Derek. Actually, I wanted to bring up like some words like the surface and then the depth versus the depth, and the connotation versus denotation, and generality versus the singularity, and so on. I'm not sure like if it would be helpful to bring the first chapter of Order of Things of Foucault. Like we remember last banana, like the picture, like the painting. Definitely there's like a representative images, but at the same time there are some expressions like the painter would want to express. So as I understand, if my understanding is right, there are two kind of maybe multiple levels of understanding of an event or some representativeness or representation. Definitely representativeness is not all. There is a depth, which could be also various. So what I want to say is like a representative regarding representativeness also very complex because it can be seen, which means like it can be interpreted in multiple ways according to the seer, the viewer, something like that. That's what I want to add in.
So is he saying that the expression is the actual event of dying? Is that can that be used if you have not ever experienced the act of dying? But he's saying also that that expression of dying or the process of dying, event of dying, can be represented.
I don't know if I would put it that way.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Derek.
Highlighting the limit.
Oh, JC, please.
I mean, here what I think he's doing is he's demonstrating the limits of representation, and that expression is able to get into the singularities, into the actual events or sense of what is being expressed, right? And I think that the key sentence is that representation must encompass an expression which it does not represent, but without which itself be comprehensive. And so I think that that's the primacy, I would say, of expression and limits of representation.
That's closer to, I think, my understanding as well, that the way that so to say, just Derek, because you asked, it's the singularity is where the story of the soldier comes in, because it's the fifth series, and so I think that's actually what JC is talking about. Feels right to me as well, if we're talking back towards that kind of representation. To read this, representation only has truth concretely by means of the event it develops, giving it an open problematic structure, a where, a when, these questions that can be added to it, but it always remains external and abstract in the concept and its instances. The nature, the shortcoming of representation is absolutely what he's talking about here, I think. It seems to fit. 15th series, sorry, 15th, not 5th. Series of singularities. The mortally wounded soldier who is no longer brave or cowardly, no longer victor or vanquished, but rather so much beyond at the place where the event is present, participating therefore in its terrible impassibility. To know that, why can't we have that writing in this section?
Yeah. So yeah, I agree. I think that sentence, representation must encompass an expression which it does not represent, but without which itself would not be comprehensive. So comprehensive is one of the classes. Earlier we had the notion of representation, distinct, adequate, or comprehensive. But to be comprehensive, it must encompass the expression. And he goes on to say, to know that we are mortal is an apodeictic knowledge, albeit. So we know it's a kind of, we know that, but it's empty and abstract.
So true representation.
We know it in an empty and abstract way. Effective six do not suffice, of course, do not fulfill this knowledge adequately. So as long as one does not come to know death as an impersonal event, provided an always open problematic structure.
Mm-hmm. So that's a kind of a paradox to represent what you cannot represent, right?
No, I think it's what it is. Because it goes on. So later on it says representation attains this topical idea only by means of the hidden expression which it encompasses. That is by means of the event it envelops. There is thus a use. So this is where. So remember we talked about the usage of representation. There is thus a use of representation without which representation would remain lifeless and senseless. So representation receives its life. We know that we are going to die. We have this what he calls. To know we are mortal is an hyperdectic knowledge. We know that indisputably we will die, but it has no meaning, intrinsic meaning to us. He says unless we get this notion of expression, and it's this use of. So the question is about the usage of representation in the relationship between logic and ethics. There is a usage of representation, and this is the structure that Deleuze is laying out in terms of the representation encompasses the expression, and the expression that's what gives the representation life. It's without which it remains lifeless.
Okay.
It reminds me of a discussion from God, this push to talk is killing me. I know I can change it. From the Vedic text about the god of death. You ask me whatever you want, and he says you can't. You can ask me anything, right? But and you know, hold in your mind, and I'll tell you. And then he says, but don't. You can't ask me about death. Don't ask me what death is. I don't know.
And I think also at the end of this paragraph, I think there's that idea of the hem or the lining, which is kind of interesting. I don't quite know where it's going to go, but with that, so representation envelops the event in another nature, envelops it at its borders, it stretches until this point, and it brings about this lining or hem. This is the operation which defines living usage. So I think the living usage I would suggest is this kind of relation of the this encompassing by representation of expression. This is the operation which defines living usage. The extent that representation, when it does not reach this point, remains only a dead letter, confronting that which it represents, and stupid in its representativeness.
I think because that's kind of making this sort of zombie nature that representation has, where the earlier part here, let's say we're talking about death as it's happening or things around us, but at some point representation envelops the event in this secondary nature, envelops the event at its borders, stretches until this point, brings about this lining or this hem, this way that it stitches itself into other things. And this is the line, it's the living usage, which I really like. The extent that representation, when it does not reach this point, remains only a dead letter confronting that which it represents and stupid. It's the way that we end up able to utilize representation almost entirely divorced from the event without that the sort of living reality of the bodies or the things or the event really inside of it. It's sort of sewn itself into our setup. And that's this, it becomes, I mean, this is, I think he's aiming at the idea of the quasi-cause here. And that, because he dives right into it, and it feels like that fits the idea of the giving a body to a incorporeal effect, this understanding of such a thing. That feels like what he's pointing towards. The line before, there is thus a use of representation, without which representation would remain lifeless and senseless. And we need the representation, as he talks about Wittgenstein, the again, the meaning, we define meaning by means of use, but such use is not defined through a function of representation in relation to the represented, nor even the representativeness as the forms of possibility. What it actually is this weird thing that representation does by sort of enveloping the event and stitching itself into essentially the fabric of reality and becoming itself a thing that is stupid in its representativeness. I think it feels like that's towards what he's pointing to, at least to me.
You got the point, Brooks. I agree with you. And then I am also interested in like the word expressions like lifeless and senseless. To whom? In what way? What I mean is like representation, as far as I understand, it's like the matter of how to be taken, how to be taken by many things. So for example, death, it could be a personal thing, like the corporeality of incorporeality, things like that, something personal, something singular. But when it can be taken as a representativeness, as a representation, then that can be turned into something general. And then sometimes it has a limit. Somebody mentioned that representation itself can encompass or cannot encompass the whole thing, whole expressions. So it's kind of like both ways, like representation as something general, something to be taken by many people or many plural, subjects. It can be something general. What do you think about this idea?
I have so much to think about now. I don't have an immediate reaction. I don't. I'd love to say I do, but I do not. I liked all of that. I just have to think through it. This is a nightmare section. Ultimately,
I think that's what Yama actually also says, is that death is a very personal thing, and that the self is the only thing that defines it. That's who is the god of death that is being discussed within that Vedic text in particular. They're talking about with he says, don't ask me about that. And then of course the guy's like, well, that's all I want to know since you told me I can't know that. And then he's like, all right, fine, I'll tell you. I mean, we're not exactly, it's impossible to be exactly clear, but self is the only thing that is, truly intemporal, and it can continue on and defines itself, and the circumstances of that are define themselves as well, of that being death. The circumstances of death define themselves by that as well. So that's I feel like a resonant response. Like,
but the expression he talks about is a kind of is a kind of knowing, right, about the the knowledge about the event is a kind of something related to death, right?
I think he's using death here as an example of how representation sort of plays within the moments of what the bodies are around death, because death itself has just a handful of sort of bits that make it the thing that it is. We have the perception of death as a states of affairs and as a quality, which is, death is a thing a person can become. It can be a quality. That is dead. Something is dying. Something is death. But then we also have the other, which is like the signification of mortality. Where, like, in order to make sense of death isn't just like some random thing. Death has a series of physical qualities. Heart stops beating. Person's breath stops. Their body becomes still. It grows cold. These are like the qualities of the thing. But that doesn't mean shit. That can just mean maybe the person's getting cold or their breath is slowing or that doesn't mean anything. In order to have the representation of death, we also need the signification. The signification is ultimately the conception of mortality. And mortality is a thing that is its own sort of fucking nightmare. The chain and understanding of what mortal means, that we do die, and what death means as an impending thing. That's a thing that we literally have to be taught as its own sort of signification. And my son's 3.5, and we had to explain what death is recently because we found a dead bird. These things happen, and we're taught sort of what death is and how everything dies. Mommy and daddy will live forever. Don't worry. He's only 3. Maybe you're a better parent than me, but those are like the two sides of it. And representation is the expression, the event of death that sort of plays in an interesting place, because the event of death actualizes the concretes I was talking about, the breath growing cold, breath slowing down, heart beating, stopping, all of that. And then expressed in mortality as a thing. Representation must encompass expression, the entire expression. It doesn't represent that. But without that, it would not be comprehensive. The idea of death needs to be comprehensive. We need to have these things that allow it to be comprehensible. Otherwise, the representation sort of doesn't fucking work. And to go back to the soldier, which I think is a spot-on relation to this, the the singularity of the moment of death that soldier is experiencing. The line is, he's a soldier, there's death, he's dying in war. Is it valor or cowardice or all these things? None of that matters in that event. It's the event of the soldier's death is one that he can't pass. It has all these other significations and layers on top of it we want to add, but there's like the representation itself is like the sewing of all of these things together inside of a pocket. I've sewed them into a big old fucking quilt, and this square of the quilt is death, and I'm sewing it into these other things, and it contains these elements as much as possible. And that's kind of why he's using death as the example here, because it's just a very nice sort of clean element. As we move sort of forward, like this limitation of representation, which is a huge limitation because it has to have these pieces inside of it. It can't do shit if it doesn't have these things inside of it or have these things as part of it. Representation is like pointless, but it also lives on because it becomes a thing that we then speak of on its own, sort of not divorced, but it's not like when I say, oh, and it's the death of the author. I'm not talking about like I have representation there. It's playing in a very different thing in order to generate sense. It doesn't have sense itself. It has to play again inside of that. And this becomes that recursive sort of nightmare that we've gone through the first 7 series. And so as we kind of move now, it's look that these elements, and again, this is how I'm interpreting all of this. So please feel free, anyone, to dive in a second. But this last bit in this thing is the big win, or the big sort of point. Representation envelops the event in another nature. It envelops it at its borders. What if we think of all words and representations as being part of a gigantic surface that all of them get connected on? There's edges to all of these. Death and a cup. I'm drinking an energy drink right now for my caffeine. The representation of energy drink versus death doesn't share a lot of shit. They're not the same, like next to each other territories on this grand surface. They all have their own little bits and singularities that I'm utilizing. Now, where are the edges of death? In order to get to the edges of them, like the topology of representation, representation stretches to this point, and it hems itself in. This is the operation which defines living usage. To the extent that representation, when it does not reach this point, remains only a dead letter confronting that which it represents and stupid in its representativeness, without being comprehensive. That's the whole point of this paragraph, is that there's representations that don't have this comprehensiveness, that are not intrinsically distinct, adequate, or comprehensive, because it has to have this other expression underneath it. And that this paragraph feels like what it's pointing at is saying, you need these elements inside of it, which is ultimately generates what its use is, but this is how that sort of happens. Sorry for the long ramble. That feels like just this paragraph.
Yeah.
So what is the?
Yeah, I think the thing that he actually says that death as an impersonal event, and I think this is the crucial line in which he's saying the expression is impersonal. And the other words he used for that, I think, like impassible and neutral. This is what is contained. This is what it is within representation. This is the expression of death is an impersonal event. And the next paragraph, it kind of develops this thought a bit further by saying the Stoics say identifies with the quasi-cause, which is also this impersonal thing.
Before we move the further next part, kind of like regarding the relation between representation and then expression, it might be easier to think it mathematical way. Like if you think about sets, like maybe like a representativeness. If you set up, if you propose like a universal set, maybe I'm not sure, like that could exist, but a point is that representation and the expression could have intersection, and then maybe there could be complementary set, and there could be like some kind of overlapping part, or not, something like that.
Well, I think what you're saying and what you're leading towards gets towards this last massive paragraph, and kind of if there is a thrust to the ethics, if there, like, the closest I come to understanding where ethics can actually be found inside of this is actually this last paragraph as a sort of how to be kind of ethics, and talking about the Zen archer and a few others. The way representation can play, because once it encompasses and has these elements inside of it, we can, or it does sort of give us this natural understanding of cause. At this point, I would say quasi-cause, where death is the quasi-cause of everything that's happening, even though it's the representation that's describing the event. Again, this non-personal death and the way that we're talking about it, it's a thing that exists awkwardly, because it sort of wills these things to happen, that the death causes these other things, when in reality it's a representation, which is ultimately just a collection of denotation and signification and a few other things. Like, it doesn't do anything. It's not like, it's a quasi-cause. And so once we start playing in the world of representations and we have this idea laid out in front of us of, here are the things that are doing the stuff, or here is, I think he uses the example of the actor and the characters, that the actor is one who lives now inside of our space, inside of Chronos perhaps, or whatever. They occupy the instant, the space there, but then they have the characters that they play sort of pushing into the future or the past. Like that thing that he's pointing at feels a lot like how we also need to be regarding representation, because as we have the bodies directly around us, as we have the things that are, let's say, in my immediate area, even almost quite literally, but I'm playing with representation, I end up pointing it in whole different directions and other spaces entirely. And it's the representation that can control us by being the quasi-cause. And I think he's saying the Stoic doesn't aim to do all that depends on him to attain the end, and the end is the representational qualities. It's this last paragraph I really like, and I'm starting to be able to piece some of it together. That just feels closer. I don't know.
I think there's a kind of important element of choice within relation to ethics and in relation to will. And I think this term that he uses near the beginning of the paragraph is proeresis. This is a kind of an idea of choosing something. And he goes on to say the sage waits for the event. That is to say, understands the pure event in its eternal truth, independent of its spatial temporal actualization. So you have two things there. You have the pure event, the eternal truth of the pure event, and then you also have its actualization when it's made real in space and time. And it's something eternally yet to come and always ready to pass. And that's, as he said, according to the line of the eon. So he said the sage wills the embodiment and the actualization of pure incorporeal event in a state of affairs and is their own body and flesh, identifying with the quasi-cause. The sage wishes to give a body to incorporeal effect, since the effect inherits a cause. And I think this is a kind of it's quite. I don't think we've got time to go through this in great detail, but I think this is the kind of relation of ethics to logic that's been, as you said, indicated earlier, that's been laid out here, and there is an element of choice, will and choice, which I would associate together personally. So the sage, the role of the sage, the wise man in this case, wishes to give a body to the incorporeal effect. So we earlier on we had the relation between ethics and the physics, the ethics and the body. Here we have a relationship between logic and ethics, and the role of the sage is to give a body, to make it embody the this quasi cause, this idea, this thing, the quasi cause, the incorporeal, embody the incorporeal event.
Yes, well,
or incorporeal effect, he said.
Yeah, well, and it's to go back to his examples of the staff strikes, and I love that he uses that example. The entire point of those moments, as was once described to me by someone who's very versed in such things, is the master strikes the student whenever his head's in the clouds. It's this idea of a staff strike that brings you back to the moment, that brings you back to right here, to understand that, get your head out of that you need to be right here. And when Deleuze talks about the staff strike, but also when he talks at all about sort of the last few sections, and he says the speed at which you are to present such a thing, where what is philosophy, and you hand someone a fish, as an example from the Stoics. The speed at which you do this is the important part, because the further you are removed from such a moment, and the further you are removed from anything, you suddenly start playing more and more and more into the space of representation, or the eternal future and past, rather than just within Chronos, within the thing you're dealing with. And this feels like a lot of that following up on such a thing. The relation to the archer is closer to Zen. The bowman must reach the point where the aim is also not the aim. That is to say, the bowman himself, where the arrow flies over its straight line while creating its own target, where the surface of the target is also the line and the point, the bowman, the shooting of the arrow, and what is shot at. It's an amazing phrasing if you've ever been someone who did archery. It's not just that you like, oh, I'm aiming. It's like all of the pieces that come together, as with kind of anything that's heavily skill-based, that you have to be there in that moment. And it is, if you're playing golf, if you're playing soccer, whatever it is, you're not just thinking, excellent, kick ball, move foot. It's all the pieces coming together, everything happening. And if you start focusing too much on one or another, it's an old sports joke, but you begin to lose that focus, despite hilariously being focused on the thing. And I think a lot of that is this point, this playing with the sage, waiting for the event and allowing these things to sort of come as they pass, rather than preempt them or play in a space of eternal futures and pasts. Willing the embodiment and the actualization of the pure incorporeal event. It's such a great line.
Right. So
He goes on. I think he goes on to say the second part of that paragraph. He goes, but how could the sage be the quasi cause of the? So he said the sage is effectively the quasi cause of the incorporeal event. So how could the sage be the quasi cause of the incorporeal event and thereby will its embodiment if the event were not already in the process of being being produced in the depth of corporeal causes, or if illness was not prepared at the innermost depths of bodies. So he's bringing back the kind of bodies and the yoke, should we say, which was earlier kind of rejected in terms of divination, but now it's being brought back in terms of the sage can only be the quasi cause of the incorporeal event if the event is already in the process of being produced in the depth of bodies, innermost depth of body. Because he says the quasi cause doesn't create, it operates and wills only what comes to pass. So this must already be in motion. This already must be there. It doesn't. The quasi cause, the sage, doesn't make it happen. It operates, his word, and wills, has this notion of choosing something.
Well, it's his use there of Goldschmidt's example of the walk makes it just so clear to me. Now, I'm starting to piece things together. I hope someone else is too. But Goldschmidt says, with respect to an event such as going for a walk, quote, the walk, incorporeal insofar as it is a way of being, acquires a body under the effect of the hegemonic principle which is manifested in it. I go for a walk. Now, going for a walk is nothing. It's incorporeal. It's just a way of being. I'm walking somewhere. I'm doing a thing. Again, it's Alice becoming bigger, the same type of thing. But it's the bodies that are manifested within it. It acquires those bodies. And it's this really interesting way of, again, turning back on, I mean, isn't that the first series? Coming back around to that idea? Sorry, Derek, I didn't mean to interrupt. You were just such a good placement for that.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I think I'd finished, but so he says, then he goes on, perhaps we can go through this to get to the end, because corporeal causes act and suffer through a cosmic mixture and a universal present which produces an incorporeal event. Trying to get to this notion of the actor and the character he plays, but the quasi-cause operates by doubling this physical causality. Let me see. Let's just go to that. The actor occupies the instant, while the character portrayed hopes or fears in the future, or remembers or repents in the past. So he has this relationship between an actor and the character that the actor is portraying. The character in their role, the character expresses hopes or fears in the future and remembers and repents of the past. And it's in this sense that the actor represents. So I think this is quite a useful kind of example, because hopefully it makes clearer the idea of representation that he's dealing with. So this usage, like I said, it's the usage of representation that he keeps talking about. So the actor, you could say the actor represents the character, but only in the sense that the character is there in the instant, is there at the absolute moment in time. So in that sense, if you want to relate it to these notions of time, eon and chronos, you could say, I don't know if I'm being accurate in saying this, but you could say the actor occupies the instant, the present, the chronos, while the character portrays hopes and fear in the future, remembers or repents in the past. So I think that's the character of the eon. And this is that relationship between the two that's being expressed, but in the actor represents in this way.
Yes, 100%. Well, I just watched Pig, and I love this example. I just watched the movie Pig, and at any screenshot at any point, it looks like a homeless Nicolas Cage. Like, that's the actor in any moment just occupies that instant. But the character, which, by the way, see the movie, it's extraordinary. The character portrayed hopes and fears in the future, remembers or repents in the past. I don't see Nicolas Cage looking homeless as I watch the movie, nor do I really remember that having watched it. The actor represents. That's what they're doing. They're playing these roles that make me understand that there's more in relation to things in the future or the past. And this package, again, sewn up tightly, if an actor's very good, just changes what that thing means or how it represents to me. It's a very clear example. It's a great one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I think
the ending
sorry.
sorry, go.
Sorry.
Go.
Ollie, you go. Go.
Actually, I think like I would say the same thing. Like the last part is amazing. Like everything is now very clarified, I think. And then the next part, like to limit actualization of the event in a present without mixture, to make the instant or the more intense thought and instantaneous, since it expresses a limited future, a limited past. This is use of representation. So maybe I'm wrong. So please correct me. As far as I understand, representation like should I say it this way, bait to understand the whole iron, like a limitless, like a possibility, can start from representation, even though that has a limit, but it also make it possible to encompass various many expressions possible, something like that. If I'm wrong, please correct me.
I feel like, sort of. So I have a slightly different take from how I'm reading it. If we're starting from the actor or the sage or the moment or the like, not from representation, but the bodies, and we move up and we are making our way through that, or we're starting with the sage who starts at event and plays with them sort of all over. Those things are ones where it's almost total possibility. Representation is decidedly limiting if we start from there, because it kind of just already encompasses and brings what it does down. And I think that's the line here he ends with, to continue what you were saying, the mime, no longer the fortune teller. One stops going from the greatest present towards a future and past which are said only of a smaller present. On the contrary, one goes from the future and past as unlimited all the way to the smallest present of a pure instant, which is endlessly subdivided. This is how the Stoic sage not only comprehends and wills the event, but also represents it, and by this selects it, and that an ethics of the mime necessarily prolongs the logic of sense. Beginning with the pure event, the mime directs and doubles the actualization, measures the mixtures with the aid of an instant without mixture, and prevents them from overflowing. At least that's how it feels. I sadly have a very quick hard stop here. Any last thoughts on this? Because we did actually make it to the end inside of 2 hours. And I think we actually made some good progress. Does anyone have any last thoughts or comments or anything before we start closing out?
Yeah, I think that notion of representation as mime is important. It's one perhaps to bear in mind for future reference.
Yes, it is 100%.
Because it's going from one of like copying something, and sort of the extrinsic relation of resemblance or similitude to one of mime. I think that's a kind of interesting idea which will be developed, I suspect, or hopefully develop further.
Thanks, fellas. Have a good one. I'll talk to you later. I'm out too.
So,
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much. It was a great talk.
yeah, it was great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Please,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
stick around if you have any questions or comments. I do have to bounce myself. This has been wonderful.